I'm going to start with a brief introduction. I know people are getting something to eat and getting a drink, but we've got a fabulous panel here, and while they're getting mic'd, let me just make a few comments by way of introduction as people come back in. Our topics over the next 50 minutes or so are relating to land, water, and wildlife. Or the nexus between the unique Western geography and ecology with questions of American identity, ideology, American imagination. I mean, so much of our ideas of who we are as a people are still affected by the idea of the West, the reality of the West, over the early history and development of the West. And clearly the Western landscape, flora and fauna, and actually just the topography has affected really profoundly who we are as a people. Even before the West was physically explored, the idea of the West was incredibly powerful in American imagination. Even great writers like Thoreau wrote about the West. Now, for him, the West might have been Concord, Massachusetts, as opposed to Boston, but the whole idea about what the West represented was extraordinarily important to him, to Emerson, and then, of course, to many of the pivotal figures who actually wrote about the West directly, whether they were people like John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and others. We've heard a little bit already about the concept of the frontier in American history, and there have been many, seminal books written about the power of the frontier, the idea of the frontier in American history. Early reports, writers, settlers, were about the West in the context of how the sky is bigger here, the stars are brighter, the horizons are broader, the animals are bigger and wilder and fiercer. So all of these things featured enormously in our early history and still have a lot of resonance. Ideas of self-reliance and freedom. So we're going to talk about this today now that we're all settled and mic'd here. We have three terrific discussants to share ideas with you. Two very distinguished and prolific historians. One focused especially on environmental history and policy. One focused especially on really the natural history of the West, and especially the fauna of the West. And also, and I think very appropriately, a novelist, someone who writes beautiful fiction about the West. So with us, Sarah and Dan, historians, Western historians, environmental historians, and Molly, an Oregonian and a very gifted writer about many of these themes. So let me just jump right in, and maybe with you, Sarah. One of the things one of the physical features, and we've already heard something about it, that sort of defines the West and still has incredible significance in the West is water. We've heard about how many of the Native Americans lived along watersheds and rivers, and the scarcity of water compared to the rest of the country has had enormous implications, and of course still has implications. So I wonder if you could just start with us about your sense of just how important water is to our understanding of the West and settlement of the West.
Sure. I think that was one thing that a lot of Easterners weren't very prepared to take into account, was that as they traveled westward, particularly to settle, they weren't paying attention to the lessons that many Native peoples had already learned, that you better live where there's water, you better live within the carrying capacity of the water of a region. And what they were not very aware of is that there is quite a demarcation in terms of rainfall between a more verdant east and a much more arid west. In fact, Stegner has said, the writer Wallace Stegner has said that aridity is what really defines the West. And it was John Wesley Powell who articulated what that demarcation line was. He was able to say that basically it's the 100th meridian. And the 100th meridian runs up through central Texas, Kansas, Oklahoma, the Dakotas. And what that segregates is more rainfall to the east, and the magic number for what's seemingly wrongly called dry farming, but the magic number for being able to farm without irrigation is 20 inches of rain per year. And typically, east of the 100th meridian, that's what you get. And typically west of the 100th meridian, you don't, which means you can't live in the west like you've lived in the east. And that's going to be a huge problem when you have things like the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act is going to try to convey land in the kinds of quantities that Easterners were used to. In Virginia, 160 acres seems like a very logical farm plot to be able to farm. Well, that works really great if you don't have to irrigate it. But if you're suddenly out in the West and there's not much water, trying to figure out how to irrigate 160 acres of land, that's an exercise in going broke really quick. I think that's where that thing about if you want $1 million ranch, you start with $2 million and pretty quickly you're down to $1 million. And yet it's not enough to ranch either. It's too small to ranch because you can't run enough cows to make a living on that either. So one of the things that people who began to move from the east to the west had to confront was a real sort of reorganization in their minds of how does one live successfully in this new place. And it was going to take an understanding of how to deal with water. And John Wesley Powell was the one who tried to suggest a way to do this. In 1878, he laid before Congress what some have called one of the most remarkable pieces of literature ever to come off the presses of the government printing office. Now I realize that doesn't sound like a bestseller, but it was called A Report on the Lands of the Arid Region of the United States. And I realize the title is pretty dry. But, sorry, couldn't resist. But what he understood was exactly this, that we were going to doom ourselves to failure in our settlement of the West if we tried to settle it like the East, if we brought our Eastern plants, our Eastern ideas of agriculture, and tried to settle in that way. And so he proposed an entirely new way of thinking about the West. And he divided the West not into nice square states, but into what he called watershed commonwealths. And it was basically the idea that you have to live where there's water, and you have to farm where there's water, which means like nobody's going to live in Nevada. And you have to be thoughtful and exercise good stewardship in order to be successful. Otherwise, we might have a colossal failure on our hands. But the idea that somehow there were limits to how we could settle the West did not go over well, as you can imagine, and he got hounded out of his government position, and we're left dealing with the legacy of not enough water in all the places we want to live ever since then. And we can talk to
we could spend hours just talking about water, but that was fascinating. Dan, your most recent book is The American Serengeti, the last big animals on the Great Plains, I think is the subtitle, something like that. So just tell us about that analogy and how, I mean, you know, we think of lions and elephants and wildebeests and kudu. So is that really a fair analogy for the American West and the Great Plains?
Well, I think it is.
I thought you did, so tell us why.
I think so. 10,000 years ago, we had a very precise analog of Africa in North America, and especially in the country east of the mountains, when we did have elephants. We had mammoths, and we had camels, and we had all sorts of large hunting cats, big, long-teethed hunting cats, and hunting hyenas, and a kind of a Pleistocene megafauna from 10,000 years back that was a very close analog of what one would find in Serengeti National Park today, or the Masai Mara, or in South Africa. Some of those creatures, including the lions and the camels, and amazingly enough, the horses, which 10,000 years ago comprised about 25 to 30% of the biomass of big grazing animals in the American West. If you didn't realize that, by the way, horses evolved in North America, spread around the world, became extinct in North America 10,000 years ago, and survived elsewhere for us to return them, which is why they did so well here when we brought them back. But many of those animals, like the horses and camels, became extinct 10,000 years ago and left us with a kind of an altered American Serengeti, but one that it still would be strikingly familiar to you if you were on safari, on a photographic safari in East Africa. You would have bison sort of playing the role of wildebeest. You would have wild dogs playing the role of gray wolves and red wolves playing the role of wild dogs in Africa. Coyotes playing the role of jackals. Elk playing the role of kudu. Pronghorns replicating gazelles in Africa. So we had this version of an American Serengeti that survived down into the historic period. And this is the fauna of the American West that the earliest explorers, the Spanish explorers coming up from the Southwest, and later coming out of Eastern America, people like Lewis and Clark and John C. Fremont encountered. So what I want to try to convey to you guys about this are a couple of sort of big elemental points about this remarkable fauna that at the time in the 19th century was thought of as one of the great marvels of the world. It was one of the great bestiaries known anywhere on the globe. And the first thing I want you to recognize about it is that while we tend to think of the country east of the Rockies today as flyover country, or if it's drive-through country, you try to do it at night so you don't have to actually experience the Great Plains. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Great Plains was where all the action was. When we think about the Old West, those of us who are going to go to Bill Koch's ranch tomorrow, that portrayal will be really of the Great Plains West. Because the Great Plains, if you think about it, was where the cattle drives were. It was where much of Lewis and Clark's famous exploration and encounters with animals like grizzly bears and innumerable herds of bison were located. It was the place where many of the Indian wars took place. It sort of really configured later Western American history. And one of the reasons the Great Plains was the location of all the action is because that's where the wildlife was. The mountains were thought of as wildlife poor. Lewis and Clark couldn't wait to get out of the Rockies and back to the Great Plains where they had abundant wildlife to harvest. And so thinking of the West in that way, we all know that there were many Wests. There still are. There's the Pacific Northwest, there's the Desert Southwest, there's the Rocky Mountain West, the Great Basin, the Great Plains. That was all true in the 18th and 19th centuries as well. And the action, because of this tremendous abundance of animals that was almost unrivaled anywhere in the world except for Africa, was the primary reason. One of the things I want to do today, and I'll do this and I'll yield the floor, but I want to read you two quotes. The first one I want to read you, these 19th century accounts, as Virginia Scharf was displaying with the Susan McGoffin account of the Santa Fe Trail, are really a great way to sort of experience a kind of time travel version of what it was like in those days. I want to read you a quote that was written in his journal by John James Audubon, who was the most famous naturalist in America in the early 19th century. He had just written a book, of course, called The Birds of America, had toured Europe promoting it, and he comes back and decides to go west so that he can write a book about the mammals of North America. So he's on board a steam vessel named the Omega. He's in what is now western North Dakota. I just heard Bill Maher say the other night, there shouldn't be 2 Dakotas. And that's ridiculous. There should only be one because we all make jokes about the Dakotas. The Dakotas in 1843 is where the action was. Listen to what Audubon says. He's on the prow of this vessel, the Omega. We passed some beautiful scenery and almost opposite had the pleasure of seeing 5 mountain rams or bighorns on the summit of a hill. We saw what we supposed to be 3 grizzly bears, but could not be sure. We saw a wolf attempting to climb a very steep bank of clay, and on the opposite shore, another wolf was lying down, looking on us like a dog. I forgot to say that last evening we saw a large herd of buffaloes with many calves among them. They were grazing quietly on a fine bit of prairie. They stared and then started at a handsome canter, producing a beautiful, picturesque view. We have seen many elks swimming the river. These animals are abundant beyond belief hereabouts. And if ever there was a country where wolves are surpassingly abundant, it is the one we are now in. That's the account of 2 days on the Missouri River in 1843. He closed that with a note to his wife telling her, I am so excited I can't go on. He was absolutely stunned by what he saw. A little later this morning, I'll read you this other quote that was written only 26 years later, and you can form your own impression.
Wow. Well, there's still extraordinary wildlife here. I was late for breakfast this morning. I have a little pointing dog, a puppy, and we were walking out just behind our house near Owl Creek, and she went on point, and I expected a grouse to flush, and this huge bear just lumbered right out in front of us, and fortunately ran the other way. So we still have remarkable, I don't have that happen to me too many mornings in Washington, D.C. Molly, like I think most great writers, there are certain themes or questions that recur repeatedly in your works. And, you look at them from different angles, different perspectives, through different prisms. I wonder if you could just share how some of those questions you keep returning to relate to the idea of the American West and the character that we associate with the American West.
Well, I guess in most of my writing, I'm trying to fill in some of the missing stories, particularly of women in the West. But the reason I'm interested in writing about the West at all relates to what Sarah and Dan have been talking about, the Great Plains. Because when I was a kid, my dad was from Texas, and when I was a kid, we used to make these long car treks from Oregon to Texas to visit his family there. So I was addicted to cowboy novels at that time, because that's what my dad read as well. And I'm sitting in the back seat of the car reading my cowboy novels as we're driving across the landscape of those novels, nearly all of which were set in the Great Plains, not in the Oregon that I knew, or California at all, but in the Great Plains. And I remember in one particular instance, I'm reading a novel that was set on the Green River in Wyoming, and we're driving alongside the Green River in Wyoming. And I guess that experience at a critical time in my life, I was probably 12, 13, 14, really is the reason why I'm writing about the West now. But my interest then, now as a writer, is to write the novels that I haven't found on the library shelf. The stories about the Pacific Northwest, which is a different West from the Great Plains, particularly the Eastern Oregon landscape, which is very much like the Great Plains, actually. And writing about the stories of women in particular because they're so non-existent in most of the cowboy novels that I grew up reading. The other focus that I have in my writing is to try to demythologize the cowboy hero. I grew up reading Shane. Many of you have probably read it, or at least you've seen the film. Shane is maybe our quintessential cowboy hero, isn't he? He comes into the valley from who knows what his history is, doesn't even have a last name. He saves us from the powers of evil. And he sacrifices himself to loneliness as he leaves the valley again. His job is to use his weapons and commit the violence that will save us from the bad guys. We're a really young country. We don't have a big mythology to look back to. We don't have Beowulf. We don't have King Arthur. We have just that, 25-year, 50-year history of European Americans moving into the West. And so as a result, our heroes, our mythological heroes, who tell us, this is what myths are for, tell us who we are as a people, how we should conduct ourselves, what we should value. Our heroes are the mountain men, the cowboys like Shane. And a lot of my own writing is to try to shift that myth. We need a mythology. I'm not trying to say we should dump the cowboy myth. I want to shift it a little bit. I want to nudge it toward away from the darker side, the underbelly of that mythology. Include the women. Show us the heroism of ordinary people. And that's what I am trying to do in my fiction. And I want to also just add that I'm surprised that I think I'm the only novelist here, except maybe we could include Virginia, because it does seem to me that fiction is the way that most people experience the Western mythology, either in novels or in film, but in fiction. It's not by reading the books of the historians at this conference, I think, for most people in America. They're learning about the West through the novels and the films. And so it seems to me that it's important for that voice, the voice of people like me who are writing fiction, but who are also, we are the ones who are reading the historians first before we begin to translate that into the new mythology, I hope, of the West.
Molly, let me just stay with you for a minute on this. And before we had this wolf up, there was a typical picture. I don't know if we can get it back, but I'll just tell you what strikes me, that so much of the myth of the West, which comes from film and maybe even, I think it's that one. I don't know, there are 8 or 9 men, and then I think there's a woman over near the wagon. And I think that's sort of typical of what our ideas are the West and the mythology of the West. I mean, it's mountain men, it's cowboys, it's prospectors, and it's this wild, open, free, self-reliant world where people repair their own wagons and their guns and take law into their own hands, and they don't have doctors, they don't have stores, they don't have churches, and typically they don't have women either in much of what we see. So just talk for a minute, and you could all jump in on this, because obviously there were women there, and they had incredible, heroic, brave stories. Why do we have to wait for contemporary novelists like you to tell the story of the Western woman?
Well, I think women's stories have just been ignored for so long, and most of the actual women who lived in the West in those early days, who wrote diaries, kept journals, later wrote memoirs, there was very little attention paid to that private writing by historians. It was in later years with people like Richard White and Patricia Limerick who began to shine a light on that private writing, because it was not the women who were writing the histories of the West. And it wasn't until historians turned their attention to the private writing that women's stories began to bubble to the top. There certainly were women, and my attention has, in fact, mostly been on women in the later homesteading period. I was telling my table mates this just a little while ago that it's estimated that somewhere between 18 and 30% of all homestead claims were filed by women. But that would be in the 20th century, because in fact there were more homestead claims filed in the first 30 years, 25 years of the 20th century than were ever filed in the previous 50 years that we think of as the settling of the West. The homestead period is really more a 20th century phenomenon. And of those homestead claims, up to a third of them were filed by women. And women had a better rate of proving up on their claims than men did.
Sarah, let's just stay on homesteading for a minute. What is it that's different about homesteading and the story of Western settlement from homesteading and settlement in the rest of the country?
So I did want to add just one point
Sure,
to the
please.
thing about why do we not have enough stories about women. And there's a wonderful proverb that goes, I'm going to get this mostly right, I think, until the lions have their historians, tales of hunting will always glorify the hunter. And until you have
Yeah.
women who are trained as academics and writers, who are writing novels, who are writing histories. And of course, the reality is people want to know about who they are and where's my track through the past. It's the same reason, once we begin to see Indian people getting degrees and doing, we suddenly see
Telling their
much
stories.
more, we see much more about Native American history. Same, we have civil rights movement, and we get more African American history. So a lot of it has to do with who's asking the questions and what kinds of questions they ask about the past. And certainly the homesteading question is a good one, in part because for people who are moving to the West, part of what you get is this sense of being able to start over. Much of what's in the East has been used and reused ever since colonial settlement. And so the possibilities of kind of land that has not been worked or has been worked minimally is what creates opportunity for many in the West. Of course, it's not vacant land by any means, and that was one of the unfortunate consequences of the Homestead Act. Was there was an assumption that the West was empty. It's not. It's full of people. They've been living there for tens of thousands of years, as we saw in our discussion from last night. But those people who do want to move to the West are going to nevertheless try to import what they know from the East when they move to the West. So they bring non-native plants, non-native animals, and those aren't adapted to the West. They're adapted to the East. And so it's often a frustrating fix. And it creates a demand for water in the West that would be like that in the East, only we ain't got it here. So, people love to have beautiful lawns. Well, what do they plant as their lawns? Kentucky bluegrass. So it's from Kentucky. It really shouldn't be growing in Phoenix. So you got to water the heck out of it to make it grow in Phoenix. But by gosh, I want a lawn, because that's somehow the marker of having established yourself. Mm-hmm. And so I think that was one of the real challenges as people moved to the West.
Mm-hmm. Dan, let's talk again about some of the iconic fauna. We have this giant buffalo out in our lobby, and you referenced coyotes. Tell us a little bit about the differing natural history of these two species. We almost exterminated the bison, and there's various mythologies about why they came close to being exterminated, and I'd love your thoughts about that. But on the other hand, we tried to exterminate the coyotes, and even, inspired by Mark Twain and others about, they need to be, eliminated. Yet now, I won't see a bear in my backyard in Washington, D.C., but I might see a coyote.
Right.
So just tell us a little bit about those two classic Western species and their evolution.
Well, to get to that explanation, let me tell you an aphorism that ecologists have shared with the rest of the world. Ecologists will sometimes say that if you take a petri dish and put a species of bacterium in it and provide that bacteria with a source of food, if you don't provide a regulatory second bacterium as a kind of a predator and simply let a bacteria or bacteria alone have access to food in a petri dish, they will quickly eat all the food until it's all gone, and then they will die. In other words, those bacteria get the kind of freedom that we had in the American West in the 19th century. And one of the reasons we love the American West still today, we're all entranced with the image of the Old West, I think is the idea, a core idea from the whole American story of freedom of action. But let me tell you, to build up to an answer to your question, Elliot, when we had completely unregulated freedom in the American West and had all this wildlife that I gave you sort of a sample of from John James Audubon's description in 1843, we had something like, just to give you a quick rundown, depending on the climate, between 20 and 30 million bison, 15 million pronghorns. After they went wild following the Pueblo Revolt of 1680 in New Mexico, between 1 million and 3 million wild horses spreading across the West and reoccupying their old evolutionary background, between 500,000 and 1 million gray wolves as keystone predators, about 50,000 grizzly bears, and something I often tell groups of people when I speak about American Serengeti, almost everybody has seen now The Revenant, which features Leonardo DiCaprio, of course, reprising this famous story from the 1830s West when Hugh Glass was mauled by a grizzly and basically crawled to civilization to seek revenge on those companions who abandoned him. That story, of course, in the movie takes place in the high Rockies. That story in reality took place in South Dakota. And the reason it took place in South Dakota is because where the grizzly bears were in the 19th century was out on the Great Plains where the buffalo were, because they acted as scavengers of buffalo carcasses. So we had all this tremendous wildlife. As I mentioned earlier, one of the great marvels of the world, so much so, and this is probably where I got the idea of calling the Great Plains the American Serengeti, many of the same people who pioneered the hunting safari in Africa starting in the 1830s ended up coming to the American Great Plains and conducting these grand safari hunts right through the 1870s. So, given complete freedom to do what we wished with those animals, what we did was essentially obliterate virtually every single one of them. By the end of the 19th century, we had about 1,000 bison left in North America from what only 100 years before had been probably 30 million. We had about 13,000 pronghorns left out of what had been 15 million. We had only a few hundred grizzly bears now driven into the mountains, as were the elk, which had also been Great Plains animals. And so allowing the selfish gene to work on the American frontier essentially resulted in the obliteration of this great wildlife that we had. I mean, we reduced gray wolves to the point that by the 1920s, we had even killed them in Glacier National Park and in Yellowstone. I mean, one of the stories I tell in American Serengeti is about a state where I lived for 20 years or so, Montana, that used up 2/3 of its territorial budget in the 1880s paying bounties to kill wolves and coyotes. And by the 1890s, Montana was bountying about 30,000 gray wolves a year and about 30,000 coyotes. So this will get to the explanation for your question. By 1920, Montana paid bounty on 17 gray wolves and 30,000 coyotes. In other words, the number of wolves had diminished to a fraction, only a tiny remnant. Coyote numbers were still where they had been. And so at the beginning of the 20th century, what people who were observing the West realized is that we've pushed all these animals to the brink of extinction, and somehow we have not been able to eradicate coyotes. Ernest Thompson Seton, the great Canadian natural history writer who ended up settling in Santa Fe, wrote a lead story in Scribner's magazine in 1900 called Tito, the little coyote who learned how, to try to explain why coyotes had survived this slaughterhouse. And he argued that Tito, this little female pup who had been captured and chained in a rancher's yard, had observed all the stratagems that ranchers use to try to kill coyotes, and she later escapes, finds a mate in the wild, and then teaches her pups all the things that humans were doing to try to wipe them out. Seton argues at the end of that essay that basically he says, you realize who Tito is? She's Moses. She's the coyote version of Moses. Raised among the Egyptians, learning all their tricks, and then leading her people to liberation. What ecologists have realized, however, is that there was another explanation, and it's basically that coyotes co-evolved alongside gray wolves, which harassed them unmercifully, and they evolved a set of adaptations that allowed them, when gray wolves were gone and humans replaced gray wolves as their harassers, to survive and spread everything that we could throw at them. And we threw a lot, I can tell you. We tried to exterminate them, in fact.
Amazing. Molly, and then I'm going to, probably the last question before I open it to all of you, although I'd like to just spend all day talking to each of you. I mentioned at the beginning, one of the ideas that has animated American intellectual history is the idea of the frontier. You know, the go west young man, which we've always heard, not go west young woman, maybe we need to correct that. And you now live in Oregon. You know, there is no frontier. You know, we don't have a frontier anymore.
I'm as far west as one can go.
You're as far as west as you can go. What do you think the implications of no longer having a frontier, no longer having a place to go closer to the sunset, settling new land, has that, in your mind, affected either, you know, American history, politics, or sort of the psyche of people? You know, so many people move to Portland or to Seattle or to San Francisco, you know, just for a new start. And at one point, it really was the frontier and open, but now it's almost like the East Coast. Do you know what I mean? And
I do know what you mean, and I think that the dream state of the West still exists. When I was teaching literature of the American West at Portland State, I had students who had come to Portland to go to college from the East Coast. They were from the East Coast, who said, in taking my class on the literature of the West, who said, I came west because I thought out there I could be who I want to be. I could experience freedom and independence, that the West still holds that kind of place in our mentality as the place where one can be free and independent. And of course, then there's disappointment, which of course relates back again to the homestead movement, when all these people who came out and homesteaded in the early 1910s, 95% of them failed. And the whole history really of the West is a history of disappointment and failure. But that hasn't made it into the story that we all tell ourselves about the West. It's still a mythical story about freedom and independence and the cowboy hero.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. Let me open it up to the audience, and we need to wait for microphones. Rob.
Yeah, Molly, I was intrigued by your comment about the percentage of women in the homestead area, and I was further intrigued by Elliot's point on the painting that showed, say, 9 out of 10 men versus 1 woman. So my question is there a way to give us a sense of, during the early days of the West or the homestead area, what was the census, or is there a census of the growth of numbers of women in the early days up to the homestead era on a percentage basis?
Well, my own background is in the later period of the homestead movement, so I'm going to turn that part of the question over to them. But what I do know is that women came west for the very same reasons that men did, that the independent women did. These women who filed claims on a homestead came out because they were looking for a way to make a living that was not as a housekeeper, as a cook, and they didn't want to be married, maybe. There's a lot of history now, known history now, about people who came out escaping from bad marriages, women who came out who were lesbians, who came out together and homesteaded together. Women came out because they could file a claim on a homestead, prove up on it, and then sell out that claim in order to have a grub stake to do something else in the West. So those women who were who were single women homesteaders were not always single either. They filed on a claim next door to the claim of the man they were going to be married to. And so then the man they would marry, because you were only allowed to file a claim if you were single. So you'd file the claim, build a cabin on your property, on the property line with the man you were going to marry. Go ahead and get married, and then the 2 cabins next door to each other, and you help each other prove up on the land. So there's a lot of that going on too. But there were a lot of women who stayed single, who wanted to be single, who filed on these claims.
You know, I wonder if the story of women in the West, maybe if the injustice or lack of representation is exacerbated by the fact that in so many films and popular histories, the women you do hear about are the saloon keepers,
Yeah.
and the women working in the brothels.
Sure. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's interesting because the novel I wrote, The Jump Off Creek, is about a single woman homesteader. And I wrote that, I was working on that novel in the early and mid 1980s. And I had been reading the literature of the West my whole life, since I was 10 years old. And in all that time, and the nonfiction about the West as well. And in all that time, I had not come upon a single example of a single woman homesteader, both neither in the fiction nor in the histories. And so when I began that novel, I wasn't sure if I was making it up. I thought maybe there was no such thing as a single woman homesteader. And it was when I was doing the research for that I uncovered all these stories about these women who had homesteaded. But they were not present in the fiction. Here we go again with the importance of fiction. They were not present in any of the fiction, and they were hardly mentioned at all in the histories. Where I found their stories was in, the regional histories that you find, like if you go to a small historical society in a small town in the West, and they always have a regional history that some native son has put together that's basically the story of everybody who ever lived in that county. And there you would find the stories about the single woman homesteaders in those pieces, but not in the larger histories of the West and not in the fiction of the West.
Okay, gentlemen, 2/3 the way back.
My question is sparked by Dan's comments about Hugh Glass, the Hugh Glass story, and the fauna that Audubon saw. The great ecologist Dan Botkin has a book entitled Our Natural History, in which he follows the trail of Lewis and Clark and uses their journals to estimate the numbers of animals that were, the density of animals. In terms of grizzly bears, he would stand up on the bank and try to see essentially how far they saw and how many bears they saw at the various places, and estimates, as I recall, that there were about 4 grizzly bears per 100 square miles along the Lewis and Clark trail through the plains. Of course, they get to the Three Forks and start into the mountains. They see the last bear at Three Forks, and it's running away because it's been shot at. Today, and my question therefore is really going to be prefaced by saying, today we have recovered grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone to about 4 per 100 square miles. And yet we won't delist them. And I'm wondering to what extent the mythology of fauna in the American West affects policy today. We've recovered them. They're in the, if you will, in the wrong place compared to Lewis and Clark. But does this mythology, this Serengeti vision of the West, enter into policy in a way that allows us, that doesn't allow us to make rational, what might be called rational choices based on history as to whether bears, for example, are endangered or not?
Well, as you point out, I mean, we've got a debate going now about delisting bears and turning management from Fish and Wildlife Service and the federal government back over to the states. And if it happens, it will be done the way it has been done with wolves in the northern Rockies, not in the Southwest yet, because the Mexican wolf has not recovered sufficiently to delist and turn management back over to New Mexico and Arizona. But in the northern Rockies, we did do that with wolves about 5 or 6 years ago, turned management over to Idaho, Wyoming, and Montana, all 3 of which immediately instituted hunting seasons on gray wolves. I mean, the last 2 or 3 years I was in Montana before I moved down to Santa Fe, I essentially, every time I would go into a sporting goods store, I would have somebody, as I checked out, try to sell me a wolf tag, because we had a 6-month-long season on gray wolves in Montana. And that, of course, is the discussion of what we will do with grizzly bears as well. There are plenty of people up in the northern Rockies who are salivating at the idea that there's going to be a hunting season. And Idaho and Wyoming have already immediately said, if delisting happens, we're going to create hunting seasons. Montana has, in this instance, sort of stepped back and said, we're going to wait to see what happens. One of the, to me, I mean, to respond to the point, I think your major point in your question, which is how has the mythology of the West affected the way we're thinking of wildlife management today? I think it's obviously plays a central role, because, I mean, just in the statement I made about hunters who can't wait to replicate Teddy Roosevelt in North Dakota shooting a grizzly bear in the 1880s. I mean, people are very, very anxious to do this. But another way that it manifests itself is in the form of an organization that's also in Montana called the American Prairie Reserve. And if you folks have not heard about the American Prairie Reserve, I want to make sure that you understand that this organization is out there, and what it is trying to do is to redress the historical mistake many of us think happened in terms of preserving some semblance of the American Serengeti on the Great Plains. Because if you think about where the public lands ended up and where our national parks ended up, particularly national parks like Yellowstone with large animal populations, they all ended up in the Rockies or the Cascades or the Sierra Nevada. And the place where all the animals were, the Great Plains, ended up with virtually no large game parks of any kind at all. We have 2 or 3 national parks on the Great Plains. They're pretty small. Tried to get a couple back in the 20s and 30s, never could quite pull it off. So American Prairie Reserve is attempting to create what will ultimately be a park or a preserve on the Great Plains in central Montana that they hope will be almost twice the size of Yellowstone National Park. Yellowstone is 2.2 million acres. They're thinking of something around 3.5 to 3.8 million acres, where not just bison get recovered in large numbers, but we also allow wild horses that were there in the 19th century and ended up all being slaughtered for pet food in the early 20th century. And also wolves and grizzlies can become a part of this natural ecological mix. And they're heartened by the fact that every spring now, grizzly bears, as they emerge from hibernation, their instinct is to go out onto the Great Plains. And they've gotten as far out as 125 to 150 miles east of the Rockies. And last spring, they got within about 50 miles of where the American Prairie Reserve is trying to combine private and public land into this big conservation program. And as soon as they get there and find buffalo there will be a grizzly bear population back out on the plains. That's obviously colored by this romance that people have of reading the accounts of Lewis and Clark, of John James Audubon, and all these others who wrote about this sort of grandiloquent expression of the natural world in the American West in the plains.
Carol.
Thank you. Sarah.
Yes.
So this week on NPR here in Aspen, we've been talking about water and the water rights and what's happening with water. Today they focused on zero planting in Tucson so that they finally recognized, that you don't take grass, and that they were talking about artificial grass. If you got to have grass, you can get the artificial kind. And actually the guy's doing very well as a business concept. So that's another thought that's possible. But then I'm also going to say that last Sunday in the New York Times was a major article on ecology, water shortage, the whole condition of where we are ecologically, and the warming of the earth, that we should have done some things 30 years ago. It's very depressing. In that article, it mentioned that the Colorado River will be down to a trickle within 30 to 40 years at the rate we are going. Yesterday on NPR, I heard, and I know you're from Utah, that Utah wants to put in a pipeline to tap into the Colorado River. Would you like to comment on that?
Oh. All right, so we're going to cancel the next 3 sessions. And, okay, so let's see. I think let's start here. Climate change is water change. And as you've seen this year and in the past several years in Colorado, as we're seeing throughout the interior West, as we experience this climate change that has, at least in Colorado, caused about a 2-degree rise in temperatures much more quickly than anybody else, we're looking at the consequences to lower snowpack, runoff, all of that. And the Colorado River, in particular, is the lifeline of the American West. And you've got 7 states in particular that are dependent on it. And I'm getting the hook over here?
No, you're not yet.
Okay.
I'm
really
getting the
fast.
hook.
And so the problem is that when we moved here as Europeans, we came with this idea that was different from what we had in the East. In the East, you have English common law, which allowed common access to the water. In the West, we have prior appropriation, first in time, first in right, which basically means if I get there first, the heck with everybody else downstream. And that sense of, I got to use it or lose it, has really, unfortunately, dictated a strategy of grabbing as much water as you can get rather than focusing on the issue of conservation. So it shouldn't surprise us that Utah is doing something like proposing this great piping scheme. Many of the states have done similar kinds of proposals because they're trying to get as much of their share as they can, especially because the upper basin states, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, and New Mexico provide all the water, and it's the lower basin states, particularly California, that suck it all up. And so, we all want ours before they get theirs. And that's just not going to work. When we allocated the river in 1922 in something called the Colorado River Compact, we allocated a river that actually didn't exist, hasn't ever existed. The water amount that we allocated has almost never existed, and as climate change and drought have diminished the supply of the river extensively, those figures have gotten more and more unrealistic. But you have someplace like California where its agricultural industry drives its entire economy still. They're not willing to negotiate a lot on water. That's just not going to be an option long term. We're going to have to talk about reallocation. And somebody once said, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. You ain't seen nothing yet until we start talking about how to allocate that. But you're right, the Colorado River in particular is in many ways the barometer of our water situation in the West, and the barometer is bottoming out. And I'm happy to talk about that for the next 3 or 4 hours if you want, but I think we have to.
Well, there will be opportunity to continue to talk about it among all of our tables, but we can't right now. And I'd just like to thank Sarah, Dan, Molly for a wonderful conversation.